Stop being dramatic, Helen, my daughter-in-law screamed as she threw scalding tomato soup across my face and chest. The next day, I installed hidden cameras throughout my house. What I discovered in just 48 hours would land her in jail and save my grandson from years of abuse. Capture immediate attention with dramatic conflict and establish the complete setup. The burning liquid hit my skin like liquid fire, but her words burned even deeper. Stop being dramatic, Rebecca shouted, standing over me with the empty ceramic bowl still in her hands, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping it like a weapon she was considering using again. I sat there in my own kitchen, the kitchen I'd cooked family meals in for 43 years, tomato soup dripping from my gray hair, my white cotton blouse stained red like blood. The soup was still steaming. It had been fresh from the stove, meant for my 8-year-old grandson Tommy's after-school snack. Instead, Rebecca had grabbed it the moment I'd asked her a simple question about why Tommy had been coming home from school with bruises on his arms. "Where did these marks come from?" I'd asked gently, rolling up Tommy's sleeves as he sat at my kitchen table, his Spider-Man backpack beside him, his homework spread out like he did every day after school. The bruises were finger-shaped, dark purple against his pale skin, and my nursing instincts had kicked in immediately. That's when Rebecca had exploded. "Mind your own business, Helen," she'd snarled, snatching Tommy's arm away from me so roughly that he winced. "These kids play rough at school. You wouldn't understand because you've been out of touch with reality for years." But I understood more than she realized. After 35 years as a pediatric nurse at Oregon Health and Science University Hospital, I'd seen every type of child abuse imaginable. I knew the difference between playground accidents and deliberate harm. Those fingerprint bruises on Tommy's thin arms weren't from rough play with classmates. They were from an adult's grip, applied with enough force to leave lasting marks. "Rebecca," I'd said quietly, my voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in my head, "I'm concerned about Tommy. These bruises look like..." That's when she'd grabbed the bowl of soup. The scalding liquid hit my face and chest with such force that I gasped, my hands instinctively flying to my burning skin. The soup was hotter than I'd realized, nearly boiling, and I could feel my skin immediately reacting to the heat. But through the shock and pain, I saw something that chilled me more than the burns hurt me. Rebecca was smiling. Not the fake, sweet smile she usually wore around my son Michael. This was different. This was satisfied, pleased. Like she'd been waiting for an excuse to hurt me, and I'd finally given her one. "Stop being dramatic," she screamed again, her voice echoing through my kitchen. The kitchen that had always been filled with love and warmth and family gatherings. "You're always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Tommy is my son, not yours." My 8-year-old grandson, Tommy, stood frozen in the doorway leading from the living room, his school backpack still strapped to his shoulders, tears streaming down his little freckled face. He'd just walked in from James John Elementary School, probably excited to tell me about his day, maybe hoping for one of my homemade chocolate chip cookies. Instead, he'd walked into a scene that would haunt him. "Grandma Helen, are you okay?" he whispered, his small voice breaking my heart. His blue eyes, so much like his father's, were wide with terror and confusion. This sweet child had just watched his mother assault his grandmother, the woman who'd been his safe haven since his family had moved into my house 6 months ago. Rebecca spun around to face Tommy, her long blonde hair whipping across her shoulders, her green eyes blazing with an anger that seemed disproportionate to anything that had happened. "Go to your room, Tommy. Right now, your grandmother is just being overdramatic as usual. She's fine." But I wasn't fine. And this wasn't dramatic. This was assault. This was abuse. And now I knew with absolute certainty that if Rebecca was willing to throw boiling soup at a 70-year-old woman for asking about bruises, then my grandson was in serious danger. Tommy looked between his mother and me, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. I could see him struggling with what to do, torn between obeying his mother and helping his grandmother. Finally, his eyes met mine, and I gave him the slightest nod, letting him know I was okay, that he should go. "It's all right, sweetheart," I managed to say, soup still dripping from my chin. "Go do your homework. I'll bring you a snack in a little while." Quote. Tommy hesitated for another moment, then slowly walked toward the stairs, his backpack bouncing with each step. But I noticed he didn't go all the way upstairs. Instead, I heard the soft creak of the third step from the bottom, the one that had squeaked for 20 years. He was sitting there, listening, probably too scared to leave me alone with his mother. Smart boy. He'd learned to be cautious around Rebecca, to read her moods, to hide when her temper flared. Those were survival skills no 8-year-old should need to develop in his own home. Rebecca watched Tommy disappear around the corner, then turned back to me with that same satisfied smile. "Now look what you've done," she said, setting the empty bowl on my kitchen counter with deliberate care, as if she hadn't just used it as a weapon. "You've upset Tommy. He shouldn't have to see his grandmother making trouble for his mother." Making trouble. That's what she called my concern for my grandson's welfare. I stood slowly, soup still clinging to my clothes and skin, and walked to my kitchen sink. The movement made my burns sting worse, but I needed to clean myself up, needed to think clearly about what had just happened and what I was going to do about it. "Rebecca," I said quietly, running cold water over a dish rag, "we need to talk about Tommy's bruises." Her laugh was sharp and humorless. "No, Helen, we don't. Tommy is my child. Michael and I will handle any concerns about our son. Your job is to provide housing and babysitting. That's it." Housing and babysitting. After I'd opened my home to her family when Michael lost his job at the shipping company, after I'd welcomed them with open arms when they couldn't make their apartment rent, after I'd rearranged my entire life to accommodate their needs, to Rebecca I was nothing more than free labor and free room and board. But I wasn't just a free babysitter. I was a retired pediatric nurse who'd spent decades protecting children. I was a mother who'd raised 4 successful, kind human beings. I was a woman who'd survived breast cancer, the death of her husband, and countless other challenges that life had thrown at me. And I was about to become Rebecca's worst nightmare. "Where's Michael?" I asked, dabbing at the soup stains on my blouse. "Working late again," Rebecca said, and I caught something in her tone. Satisfaction? Relief? "He won't be home until after 10. He's been putting in extra hours at the new job." Quote, Michael had started working at a Portland logistics company 3 weeks ago, a good job with decent pay and benefits. But Rebecca was right. He'd been working late almost every night, coming home exhausted and stressed. When he was home, he seemed distracted, worried, not like the confident, happy son I'd raised. Now I wondered if his long hours were voluntary, or if Rebecca had been making his home life so unpleasant that work felt like an escape. "I think we should wait for Michael to get home before we discuss this further," I said carefully. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "Discuss what, Helen?" "There's nothing to discuss. Tommy got some bruises playing at school. Kids get bruises. It's normal. The only thing that's not normal is a crazy old woman seeing abuse where there isn't any." Crazy old woman. There it was. The subtle psychological abuse that had been building for months. Rebecca had been slowly undermining my credibility, my mental state, making me question my own perceptions. Gaslighting, the therapist called it. Making the victim doubt their own reality. But I'd spent too many years documenting real abuse to doubt what I'd seen. Those bruises on Tommy's arms were fresh, finger-shaped, and positioned exactly where an adult would grab a child who was trying to pull away. I'd seen identical marks hundreds of times in my nursing career, and I'd testified in court about them more times than I cared to remember. "I'm going to change my clothes," I said, keeping my voice level and calm. "Then I think we should call Michael and ask him to come home early." "You're not calling anyone," Rebecca said, stepping closer to me. For the first time, I noticed that she was taller than me, younger, stronger. At 32, she was in excellent physical condition, while I was a 70-year-old woman with arthritis in my hands and a heart condition that required daily medication. If she wanted to hurt me, really hurt me, I wouldn't be able to stop her. The realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold water I'd been using to clean my burns. "Rebecca," I said softly, "I'm not your enemy. I love Tommy. I love Michael. I want what's best for this family." "What's best for this family," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was more menacing than her earlier shouting, "is for you to mind your own business and stop interfering with how I raise my son." Her son. Not our grandson, not Michael's son. Her son, like Michael's paternity, was irrelevant, like I had no connection to the child I had been helping to raise since birth. "I'm going upstairs now," I said, moving toward the doorway where Tommy had been standing. We'll talk more when Michael gets home. But as I passed Rebecca, she grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into the same spot where I'd seen bruises on Tommy. Her grip was tight, painful, possessive. Listen to me very carefully, old woman, she hissed, her face inches from mine. If you cause problems for me, if you try to turn Michael against me, if you so much as hint to anyone that I'm not a perfect mother, I will make your life a living hell. Do you understand me? I looked into her green eyes and saw something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just anger or frustration, this was calculation. This was a threat from someone who'd clearly thought about how to hurt me, how to control me, how to neutralize me as a threat to whatever she was doing to Tommy. I understand, I said quietly. She smiled and released my arm, but I could feel bruises forming where her fingers had been. More evidence, though I didn't yet know I'd need it. Good, she said brightly, her voice switching back to the fake sweetness she used around Michael. I'm so glad we had this talk, Mom Helen. I think we understand each other much better now. I nodded and walked upstairs, my legs shaking slightly from the adrenaline and shock. As I reached the third step, I saw Tommy sitting there in the shadows, his backpack still on, his homework forgotten. Grandma, he whispered, are you hurt? I sat down beside him on the narrow step, ignoring the pain in my burns and the ache in my arm where Rebecca had grabbed me. I'm okay, sweetheart. Are you okay? He nodded, but I could see he was lying. His small body was trembling, and there were tear tracks on his cheeks. Tommy, I said gently, has your mom ever hurt you, besides the bruises on your arms? He looked toward the kitchen, then back at me, fear clear in his young eyes. She said nobody would believe me if I told, he whispered. She said you're old and your memory doesn't work right, so even if I told you, you'd forget. My heart broke and my resolve hardened simultaneously. Rebecca hadn't just been abusing Tommy physically. She'd been psychologically manipulating him, convincing him that his grandmother, his primary support system, was unreliable and forgetful. Tommy, I said, taking his small hands in mine, my memory works just fine, and I believe everything you tell me. Do you understand? He nodded, tears starting to flow again. But right now, I need you to be very brave for me. Can you do that? Another nod. I need you to go to your room and stay there until your daddy gets home. Don't come downstairs no matter what you hear. And Tommy? Tomorrow things are going to be different, I promise. He hugged me then, his small arms wrapping around my neck, his face buried against my shoulder. I love you, Grandma Helen, he whispered. I love you too, sweetheart, more than you'll ever know. As Tommy went to his room, I continued upstairs to my bedroom, my mind already racing with plans. Rebecca thought she was dealing with a helpless old woman who could be intimidated and controlled. She thought wrong. But I wasn't being dramatic. I was being systematic. Because tomorrow, Rebecca would discover that this 70-year-old woman she thought was weak and helpless had just made the biggest mistake of her life. I had 48 hours before Michael's next day off. 48 hours to gather evidence and build a case that would protect Tommy and remove Rebecca from our lives forever. It was time to go to war. Follow my story until the end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm Helen Martinez, and at 70 years old, I thought the worst thing about losing my husband Roberto 2 years ago would be the loneliness. I thought having my son Michael and his family move into my large Victorian house in Portland's Hawthorne district would be a blessing. I was wrong. Dead wrong. Not literally this time, but close enough. You see, I'd raised 4 children while working as a pediatric nurse for 35 years at Oregon Health and Science University Hospital. I'd seen abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction in all its forms. I'd testified in family court over 200 times. I'd held dying children whose parents had disciplined them too harshly. I'd documented thousands of suspicious injuries and filed countless reports with Child Protective Services. But I never imagined that evil would walk through my own front door wearing designer clothes, a perfect smile, and calling me Mom Helen with that sweet, fake voice. Let me take you back to how this nightmare began, because understanding Rebecca's pattern is crucial to understanding how she almost destroyed my family. It started 18 months ago when my son Michael first brought Rebecca home for Sunday dinner. She was beautiful in that polished, artificial way that reminded me of the actresses in soap operas. Blonde hair that never moved out of place, green eyes that sparkled when she smiled, and a figure that she clearly worked hard to maintain. At 30 years old, she was 12 years younger than Michael, recently divorced, and the single mother of Tommy, my grandson who wasn't biologically related to me but whom I'd loved from the moment I met him. "Mrs. Martinez," she'd said that first evening, her voice honey-sweet as she handed me a bouquet of expensive flowers. "Michael has told me so much about you. He says you're the strongest woman he's ever known." I should have recognized the manipulation even then. Rebecca had done her homework, knew exactly what to say to win me over. She complimented my cooking, asked about my late husband with just the right amount of sympathy, and praised my parenting skills while subtly criticizing her own mother. "I never had the kind of relationship with my mom that Michael has with you," she'd sighed over my homemade enchiladas. "She was always so critical, so cold. I want Tommy to have a real grandmother, someone who will love him unconditionally." The red flags were there from the beginning, but I was grieving, lonely, and desperate for family. Roberto had been gone for 6 months, and the house felt too big, too quiet, too empty. When Rebecca suggested they move in temporarily while Michael looked for a better job, I jumped at the chance. "It would be so good for Tommy to have stability," she'd said, her hand resting protectively on my grandson's shoulder. Tommy had been 7 then, quiet and well-behaved, with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. "And honestly, Mrs. Martinez, I'd feel so much safer with you here. A single mother worries about everything, Mrs. Martinez." Even after they moved in, even after I'd insisted she call me Helen or Mom Helen, she maintained that formal distance when Michael wasn't around. It was subtle, but it created a barrier, a hierarchy, where she was the daughter-in-law, and I was the outsider in my own home. The first 6 months were actually pleasant. Rebecca seemed genuinely grateful for the help with Tommy, and she was careful to pull her weight around the house. She cooked dinner twice a week, cleaned the bathrooms without being asked, and made sure Tommy did his homework every evening at my kitchen table. But there were small things that bothered me. The way she'd redirect Tommy when he got too affectionate with me. How she'd interrupt when he was telling me about his day at school. The subtle criticism disguised as concern. "Mom Helen, you shouldn't let Tommy have cookies before dinner. Sugar affects his behavior at school." Or, "I know you mean well, but Tommy's too old to be cuddled like a baby." I told myself I was being oversensitive. After all, she was his mother. She had the right to set boundaries. And Michael seemed happy. He'd found a decent job at a local accounting firm, they were saving money by living with me, and Tommy was thriving at his new school. The first real incident happened about 8 months after they moved in. I'd taken Tommy to the park while Rebecca ran errands, and when we came back, he had a scrape on his knee from falling off the monkey bars. Nothing serious, the kind of minor injury every child gets, but Rebecca's reaction was explosive. "How could you let this happen?" She'd screamed at me, her face flushed with what seemed like genuine distress. "He could have been seriously hurt. What if he'd broken something? What if he'd hit his head?" I tried to explain that accidents happen, that Tommy had been playing normally and safely, but she wouldn't listen. She spent the next hour examining every inch of Tommy's body, looking for additional injuries, questioning him about what had happened in a way that made the poor child think he'd done something wrong. "I'm sorry, Mommy," he kept saying. "I didn't mean to fall. I was being careful." That night, I heard her on the phone with someone, probably her sister Diane, who lived in California. "I don't know if I can trust her with Tommy anymore," she was saying. "She's getting older, you know. Her reflexes aren't what they used to be. What if something serious had happened?" The seed was planted then. Helen is getting old. Helen can't be trusted. Helen's reflexes are failing. Over the following months, Rebecca watered that seed with constant small criticisms and concerns about my age, my memory, my physical capabilities. "Mom Helen, you forgot to give Tommy his vitamins yesterday," she'd say in front of Michael, even though I'd given them to him with breakfast as I did every morning. "Are you sure you locked the front door last night?" "I found it unlocked this morning, when I was certain I'd checked it twice before bed, as I'd done every night for 43 years. Tommy said you seemed confused at the grocery store yesterday, that you couldn't remember where the milk was, even though I'd shopped at that same Safeway for 2 decades and could navigate it blindfolded." Each incident was small, insignificant on its own, but together they created a narrative. Helen is declining. Helen is becoming unreliable. Helen might be developing dementia. Michael started looking at me differently. Not with suspicion exactly, but with concern, the way adult children look at aging parents when they start worrying about independence and safety. He began double-checking things I'd done, asking if I was feeling okay, suggesting I might want to see my doctor about memory issues. "Mom, it's perfectly normal," he'd say gently. "Dad went through the same thing before he got sick. There's no shame in admitting when we need help." But I wasn't going through the same thing Roberto had experienced. My mind was sharp, my memory intact, my physical health excellent for a woman my age. I was being gaslit by a master manipulator who understood exactly how to undermine someone's credibility without leaving fingerprints. The psychological abuse escalated gradually. Rebecca began helping me with tasks I'd been doing independently for decades. She'd take over grocery shopping because I seemed overwhelmed by all the choices. She'd handle my medication management because she'd noticed I'd been forgetting doses. She'd intercept phone calls from my friends because I got confused during conversations. Slowly, systematically, she was isolating me from my support system and creating a version of reality where I was a declining elderly woman who needed constant supervision. Tommy began to change during this period, too. The bright, talkative child who used to run to me with stories from school became quieter, more withdrawn. He stopped asking for bedtime stories, stopped crawling into my lap while we watched television, stopped seeking me out when he was upset or excited. When I asked him about it, he'd look nervously toward wherever Rebecca was and mumble something about being too old for baby stuff. At 7 and 8 years old, he was being taught that affection with his grandmother was inappropriate, that independence from me was maturity. The physical isolation came next. Rebecca suggested that my bedroom on the second floor might be too much for me, that I should consider moving to the small guest room on the first floor. "Just temporarily," she said, "until we can get the upstairs bathroom modified with safety bars and a shower seat." The guest room was at the back of the house, far from the main living areas, with a view of the alley instead of the street I'd watched from my bedroom window for 4 decades. It was smaller, darker, and felt like exile from my own home. But the most insidious part of Rebecca's campaign was how she positioned herself as my protector. Whenever Michael questioned her decisions about my care, she'd sigh sadly and say, "I know it's hard to accept, but your mother needs our help. I'm just trying to keep her safe." She documented everything. A notebook appeared on the kitchen counter where she recorded my episodes, times when I seemed confused, forgetful, or disoriented. Most of these episodes were fiction, but some were real moments of normal human imperfection that she reframed as evidence of cognitive decline. Tuesday, March 15th, Helen couldn't remember where she put her car keys, found them in the refrigerator. I had never put my keys in the refrigerator. But who would believe me over the concerned daughter-in-law who was so devotedly caring for her aging mother-in-law? Friday, March 18th. Helen became agitated when I suggested she shouldn't drive to the grocery store alone. She insisted she was fine, but seemed disoriented about which route to take. I'd been driving to that grocery store for 20 years. I could get there in my sleep. But Rebecca had volunteered to drive me, then deliberately given me wrong directions to make me seem confused about a familiar route. The notebook became her Bible, proof of my declining mental state that she could show to Michael, to doctors, to anyone who questioned her version of reality. And because she was a licensed practical nurse herself, something I'd learned only after they moved in, her observations carried medical weight. "I'm trained to recognize the signs," she'd tell Michael with professional authority. "Your mother is showing classic symptoms of early-stage dementia. The memory lapses, the confusion, the paranoid thinking. It's textbook. Paranoid thinking." That's what she called it when I started questioning her narrative, when I pushed back against her help, when I insisted I was perfectly capable of managing my own life. The truth was, I had been paranoid, but not in the way Rebecca meant. I'd been increasingly suspicious of her motives, her constant criticism, her systematic undermining of my independence. My professional instincts, honed by decades of dealing with manipulative parents and family members, were screaming that something was wrong. But every time I tried to voice my concerns to Michael, Rebecca was right there with her notebook, her medical background, her careful documentation of my episodes. She'd gotten so good at predicting my reactions that she could create situations that would make me look unstable. She'd hide something important, my checkbook, my phone, my medication, then find it in an unlikely place while expressing concern about my memory. She'd change plans we'd made together, then act confused when I mentioned them, suggesting I'd imagine the conversation. She'd tell Tommy to ask me for permission to do something she'd already forbidden, then use my confusion about the mixed messages as evidence that I was losing track of conversations. The gaslighting was so sophisticated, so consistent, that I began to doubt myself. Maybe I was forgetting things, maybe I was getting confused. Maybe the grief of losing Roberto had affected my mind more than I'd realized. But then came the bruises on Tommy's arms, and everything clicked into place. You see, I'd been so focused on how Rebecca was manipulating me that I'd missed what she was doing to Tommy, the quiet child who used to chatter constantly about his friends, his teachers, his dreams of becoming a firefighter, had been systematically silenced and controlled. Tommy's bruises weren't from playground accidents. They were from Rebecca's grip when she grabbed him, shook him, controlled him through physical intimidation. The fear in his eyes wasn't normal childhood anxiety. It was the hypervigilance of an abused child, always watching, always ready to flee or appease. And when I'd finally asked the right question, finally pushed back on the wrong thing, Rebecca had shown her true nature. The mask had slipped, revealing the calculating predator underneath the concerned daughter-in-law facade. Now, as I sat in my guest room, tomato soup stains still visible on my blouse despite my attempts to clean them, I understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. Rebecca hadn't just been isolating and manipulating me for 18 months. She'd been setting up the perfect scenario for elder abuse, financial exploitation, and child abuse, all while positioning herself as the long-suffering caregiver of a declining old woman and her difficult stepson. The notebook full of my supposed episodes would provide evidence of my mental incompetence if she ever needed to pursue guardianship. My isolation from friends and support systems meant no one was watching out for my welfare. My move to the back bedroom meant Michael rarely saw how Rebecca actually treated me when he wasn't around. And Tommy, sweet, innocent Tommy, was being groomed to accept abuse as normal, to stay silent about violence, to see his grandmother as unreliable and untrustworthy. But Rebecca had made one crucial mistake. She'd revealed herself to someone who'd spent 35 years recognizing, documenting, and stopping child abuse. She'd threatened a woman who'd survived poverty, discrimination, cancer, and widowhood through sheer determination and strategic thinking. She'd picked the wrong victim. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of destroying her carefully constructed web of lies and manipulation. I had 48 hours before Michael's next day off. 48 hours to gather evidence that would expose Rebecca for what she really was and protect Tommy from further harm. I'd spent my career fighting for children who couldn't fight for themselves. Now I was going to fight for my grandson and myself, using every skill I'd learned in 35 years of nursing and motherhood. Rebecca thought she was dealing with a confused, declining old woman who could be easily intimidated and controlled. Tomorrow, she would begin to learn just how wrong she was. The war for Tommy's safety and my freedom was about to begin. That evening, after cleaning the soup from my skin and changing into fresh clothes, I sat in my small guest room and made a decision that would change everything. The woman Rebecca thought she knew, the confused, declining old lady who could be intimidated and controlled, was about to disappear forever. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. I waited until I heard Rebecca's bedroom door close upstairs, then quietly made my way to the kitchen. The house was silent except for the familiar sounds of settling wood and the hum of the refrigerator I'd bought 12 years ago when Roberto decided we needed a bigger one for family gatherings. The ceramic bowl Rebecca had used to throw soup at me sat in the dishwasher, already cleaned and innocent-looking. But I could still see the scene playing out. Her calculated grab for the bowl, the deliberate way she'd aimed for my face, the satisfaction in her eyes when the scalding liquid hit me. This hadn't been a moment of anger or frustration. This had been a message. I opened the drawer where I kept important documents and pulled out a yellow legal pad I'd used for grocery lists and appointment reminders. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. At the top of the first page, I wrote, "Documentation of abuse, Rebecca Morrison, Day 1." For the next 3 hours, I documented everything I could remember from the past 18 months. Every suspicious incident, every time Tommy had seemed frightened or withdrawn, every occasion when Rebecca had corrected my memory or questioned my competence. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its sophistication. Rebecca had begun her campaign the moment she moved into my house, but she'd been so subtle, so gradual, that I'd attributed most incidents to normal adjustment stress or my own grief-induced confusion. Now, seeing it all laid out chronologically, I could see the deliberate escalation. Month 1 to 3, honeymoon period. Rebecca was helpful, grateful, the perfect daughter-in-law. But even then, she'd been gathering information about my routines, my relationships, my vulnerabilities. Month 4 to 6, initial boundary testing. Small criticisms disguised as concern. Beginning to position herself as more competent than me in areas of childcare and household management. Month 7 to 9, active undermining. Creating situations where I would look forgetful or confused. Beginning to isolate me from friends and activities. Month 10 to 12, escalation to emotional abuse. Direct criticism, manipulation of Michael's perceptions, systematic gaslighting. Month 13 to 15, psychological control. Moving me to the back bedroom, taking over my financial management, creating the documentation that would support a narrative of mental decline. Month 16 to 18, physical intimidation and child abuse. Tommy's behavioral changes, his withdrawal from me, and tonight's assault on me. The progression was textbook. I'd seen similar patterns in the families I dealt with as a nurse, but experiencing it from the victim's perspective had made it harder to recognize. Rebecca was following a classic playbook for gaining control over vulnerable family members. As I wrote, details came flooding back that I'd dismissed or forgotten. The way Rebecca always seemed to know when I'd received phone calls from friends, even when she wasn't home. How my mail sometimes arrived already opened, with Rebecca explaining that the postal service had damaged the envelopes. The gradual disappearance of photos of Roberto and me from the main living areas, replaced by pictures of Rebecca's family. Most disturbing were the details about Tommy that I had attributed to normal childhood development, his sudden reluctance to hug me in front of his mother, the way he'd started asking permission for things that had never required permission before, getting a glass of water, using the bathroom, talking to me about his day. I remembered now how he'd begun apologizing constantly, "Sorry, Grandma Helen," for normal childhood behavior like dropping a crayon or taking too long to tie his shoes. Classic signs of a child walking on eggshells, trying to avoid triggering an unpredictable adult's anger. The bruises on his arms weren't the first physical evidence. Over the past few months, Tommy had shown up with various minor injuries. A bump on his forehead that Rebecca explained as running into a door. Scratches on his back that she attributed to falling in the rose bushes. A split lip from falling off his bike. Each injury had been minor enough to seem accidental, explained in a way that made sense, treated with appropriate concern by Rebecca. But now I could see the pattern. The injuries had been increasing in frequency and severity, testing to see if anyone would question them. As a pediatric nurse, I'd learned that abusers often escalate gradually, both to desensitize their victims and to test the response of potential witnesses. If no one questioned the minor injuries, they became bolder. If their explanations were accepted without suspicion, they refined their lies. Rebecca had been preparing for this escalation for months. By 2 a.m., I had filled 12 pages with documented incidents, behavioral observations, and timeline correlations. It was more comprehensive than many of the reports I'd filed with Child Protective Services during my nursing career, and it painted a clear picture of systematic abuse and manipulation. But documentation alone wouldn't be enough. Rebecca had spent 18 months building her credibility with Michael, creating evidence of my mental decline, and positioning herself as the responsible caregiver. Her word against mine wouldn't be enough, especially given the narrative she'd constructed about my cognitive problems. I needed proof. Real, undeniable evidence that would expose her true nature and protect Tommy from further harm. The next morning, I woke with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt since Roberto's death. For the first time in 18 months, I wasn't questioning my perceptions or doubting my instincts. I knew exactly what Rebecca was, and I knew exactly what I needed to do about it. I waited until I heard Michael leave for work at 7:30, his usual time. Rebecca typically stayed in bed until 9 a.m., claiming she needed extra sleep because dealing with me was emotionally exhausting. Tommy's school didn't start until 8:45, so he'd be getting ready soon. I dressed carefully in my navy blue slacks and white blouse, the closest thing to a uniform I had. Professional appearance would be important for what I planned to do today. I styled my gray hair neatly and applied light makeup to cover the redness around my eyes from yesterday's burns. Looking in the mirror, I saw a competent, alert woman who looked younger than her 70 years. Not the declining, confused elderly person Rebecca had been describing to everyone who would listen. At 8:15, I knocked gently on Tommy's bedroom door. "Come in," he called, his voice small and cautious. I found him sitting on his bed, fully dressed for school but not moving toward the door. His backpack sat beside him, perfectly organized. Another change I'd noticed over recent months. The child who used to leave a trail of toys and clothes throughout the house had become obsessively neat and careful. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, sitting beside him on the bed. "How did you sleep?" He shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "Okay, I guess. Tommy, I want you to know that what happened yesterday in the kitchen wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." His head snapped up, eyes wide with something that might have been hope. Really? Really? Adults should never hurt each other, and they should especially never hurt children. What your mom did to me was wrong, and I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen again. But she said you made her mad because you were asking questions you shouldn't ask. My heart broke at the matter-of-fact way he repeated Rebecca's justification. She'd been teaching him that violence was the victim's fault, that questioning authority deserved punishment. "Tommy, it's never wrong to ask questions when you're worried about someone you love. And it's never okay for someone to hurt you because they're angry. Do you understand that?" He nodded slowly, but I could see the confusion in his young face. Rebecca had been rewriting the rules of acceptable behavior for months, teaching him that her violence was justified, but his grandmother's concern was inappropriate. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth, okay? Even if you think it might get someone in trouble." Another nod, more hesitant this time. "Has your mom ever hurt you? Not just yesterday, but other times too?" Tommy looked toward his bedroom door, then back at me. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "She said nobody would believe me if I told. She said you're too old to remember things right, and Daddy's too busy to listen to lies." The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. Rebecca hadn't just been abusing Tommy. She'd been systematically destroying his faith in the adults who should have protected him. "Tommy, my memory works perfectly fine, and your daddy loves you more than anything in the world. Neither of us would ever think you were lying about something important. But Mom showed Daddy the notebook where she writes down all the things you forget. She said it proves your brain doesn't work right anymore." The notebook. I'd suspected Rebecca was documenting fabricated incidents, but hearing Tommy confirm it made my anger burn hotter. She'd been using a child to validate her lies about my mental state. "Sweetheart, your mom has been telling stories about me that aren't true. Just like she might have told you stories about why you get hurt sometimes that aren't true either." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes that were far too old for his 8-year-old face. "The bruises on my arms aren't from playing at school," he whispered. "I know, honey. Can you tell me how they really happened?" "Mom grabbed me when I tried to run to you yesterday morning. She said I was being too clingy and that big boys don't run to their grandmas when they're upset. She squeezed really hard and told me to stop being a baby." Each word was like a knife in my chest, but I kept my expression calm and supportive. "What else, Tommy? It's safe to tell me." The floodgates opened then. Tommy told me about months of psychological and physical abuse. Being grabbed, shaken, slapped when Rebecca thought no one was looking. Being told that his father didn't really love him because he wasn't his real son. being threatened with being sent away if he caused trouble or told tales. Rebecca had been careful to avoid leaving obvious marks, and when injuries did occur, she'd crafted believable explanations. But more than the physical abuse, she'd been systematically destroying Tommy's sense of safety and belonging in his own family. She said if I told anyone, she'd prove you were crazy and Daddy would have to put you in a nursing home. Then it would just be her and me, and I'd be sorry I didn't listen. The threat was clear. Tommy's silence bought my freedom. If he spoke up about the abuse, Rebecca would escalate her campaign to have me declared incompetent and removed from the home. An 8-year-old child had been carrying the weight of protecting his grandmother while enduring abuse himself. "Tommy," I said, taking his small hands in mine, "you have been so brave and so strong, but you don't have to protect me anymore. It's time for the grown-ups to protect you." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make sure your mom can never hurt either of us again. But I need you to be brave for just a little while longer. Can you do that?" He nodded, and I saw a spark of the confident, happy child he'd been before Rebecca's campaign of terror. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go to school today just like normal. If anyone asks how you are, you tell them you're fine. Don't tell your teachers or friends about our conversation, not yet. Can you do that?" Another nod. "When you come home this afternoon, things might be different. There might be new people here, or your mom might be upset. But no matter what happens, remember that you're safe and loved and that telling the truth was the right thing to do." I hugged him then, and for the first time in months he hugged me back without looking over his shoulder to see if Rebecca was watching. After Tommy left for school, I returned to my guest room and opened my laptop, the one Rebecca thought I was too confused to use properly. She'd been monitoring my internet usage, I realized, which explained how she always seemed to know when I'd been in contact with friends or researching topics she didn't want me to know about. But she'd underestimated me. During my nursing career, I'd become proficient with medical databases, electronic health records, and legal research systems. I knew how to find information and how to document findings properly. My first search was for Elder Abuse Documentation, Portland, Oregon. I needed to understand the legal requirements for reporting and the types of evidence that would be most compelling to authorities. What I found was both encouraging and sobering. Oregon had strong elder abuse protection laws, but successful prosecution required substantial evidence. The fact that Rebecca was a healthcare professional would actually work against her. Medical professionals who abused elderly family members faced enhanced penalties, but they also had more credibility when they claimed their victims were mentally incompetent. I spent the morning researching surveillance options, legal requirements for recording conversations in Oregon, and the process for filing emergency protective orders. By noon, I had a comprehensive plan that would either expose Rebecca completely or destroy any remaining credibility I had with my family. The risk was enormous. If I was wrong about any of this, if Rebecca managed to spin my actions as the paranoid behavior of a declining mind, I would lose access to Tommy forever. Michael would have no choice but to believe that his mother had become a danger to his family. But if I was right, and every instinct I'd developed over 7 decades of life told me I was, then doing nothing would mean watching Rebecca escalate her abuse until something irreversible happened. At 12:30, I made the first of several phone calls that would set my plan in motion. Portland Electronics Store. This is Marcus speaking. Hello, Marcus. I need to purchase a home security system with multiple cameras, and I need it installed today. Money is no object. The plan was simple in concept but complex in execution. I had approximately 6 hours before Tommy came home from school, and maybe 2 hours after that before Michael returned from work. In that time, I needed to transform my house into a surveillance system that would capture Rebecca's true behavior while appearing to maintain the status quo. But first, I needed to make one more call to someone I hadn't spoken to in 18 months because Rebecca had convinced me that maintaining old friendships was too stressful for my declining mind. Oregon Health Sciences University, Pediatric Department. This is Linda. Linda, this is Helen Martinez. Is Dr. Sarah Chen available? I have an emergency involving child abuse, and I need her advice. Dr. Chen had been my supervisor for the last 10 years of my nursing career. She knew my competence, my judgment, and my dedication to child protection. If anyone would believe my assessment of Tommy's situation and help me navigate the legal requirements, it would be her. Helen? Linda's voice was surprised but warm. We haven't heard from you in so long. Hold on. Let me see if Dr. Chen is available. While I waited, I looked around my guest room, the small, isolated space Rebecca had maneuvered me into as part of her control strategy. By tomorrow, either I would have my house and my family back, or I would be facing accusations of senility and paranoia that would destroy what remained of my independence. But some fights are worth the risk. Some battles have to be fought, regardless of the personal cost. Tommy's safety was worth everything. Helen! Dr. Chen's voice came through the phone like a lifeline. How are you? I've been wondering how you were adjusting to retirement. Sarah, I need your help. I'm dealing with a child abuse situation, and I need to know the current reporting requirements and what kind of evidence CPS will need for an emergency intervention. There was a pause, then Dr. Chen's voice became serious and professional. Tell me everything. For the next hour, I laid out the entire situation for someone who understood both the medical and legal aspects of child protection. Dr. Chen asked detailed questions, challenged my observations, and helped me refine my evidence-gathering strategy. Helen, she said finally, based on what you've told me, this child is in immediate danger. But you're right that you'll need more than your observations to overcome the credibility issues Rebecca has created. The documentation you've started is good, but you'll need either physical evidence or recorded admissions to make this stick. I know. That's why I'm installing cameras today. Be very careful about the legal requirements for recording. Oregon is a one-party consent state for audio recording, which means you can record conversations you're part of, but video surveillance in areas where people have an expectation of privacy could be problematic. We spent another 30 minutes discussing the technical and legal requirements for gathering admissible evidence. By the time I hung up, I had a clear understanding of exactly what I needed to do and how to do it legally. The electronics store arrived at 2 p.m. with enough equipment to turn my house into Fort Knox. The technician, a young man named David who reminded me of Michael at that age, was efficient and discreet. Ma'am, I have to ask, is this for security reasons or... Let's just say I need to document what's really happening in my home, I told him, and I need it to be legally admissible if it comes to that. He nodded with understanding. We get a lot of requests like this. Elderly people protecting themselves from family members who don't have their best interests at heart. By 3 p.m., my house was equipped with high-definition cameras in every common area, motion-activated recording in the hallways, and audio recording capability in the kitchen and living room. The system was wireless, backed up to cloud storage, and accessible from my laptop or phone. Most importantly, it was completely invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. The cameras were disguised as smoke detectors, wall decorations, and electronic devices that blended seamlessly into the existing decor. Unless Rebecca specifically searched for surveillance equipment, she'd never know she was being recorded. At 3:45, I received a text from Tommy. Walking home from school now. See you soon. At 4:15, I heard Rebecca's bedroom door open upstairs and the sound of her feet on the stairs. The trap was set. The cameras were rolling. And Rebecca was about to discover that the confused, helpless old woman she thought she'd been controlling for 18 months had just disappeared forever. What happened next would either save Tommy and expose Rebecca's abuse, or it would provide her with all the evidence she needed to have me declared mentally incompetent and removed from my grandson's life. But as I sat in my chair by the window, looking completely calm and unsuspecting, I felt more confident than I had in 18 months. After all, I'd spent 35 years protecting children from people exactly like Rebecca. It was time to get back to work. The sound of Rebecca's heels clicking down the hardwood stairs at exactly 4:17 p.m. was as predictable as a metronome. For 18 months, I'd unconsciously learned her schedule, her patterns, her moods based on subtle audio cues. Today, for the first time, I was listening with the trained ear of someone gathering evidence rather than someone trying to avoid conflict. Click, click, pause. She was checking her reflection in the hallway mirror as she did every time she came downstairs. Click, click, click toward the kitchen, where she'd expect to find me preparing Tommy's after-school snack like the dutiful grandmother she'd trained me to be. But today I was sitting in the living room, clearly visible from the kitchen doorway, reading a book with perfect calm. My posture was straight, my expression alert, my movements deliberate. I looked exactly like what I was, a competent, intelligent woman who was fully aware of her surroundings. The cameras hidden throughout the house were capturing everything in high definition. Helen? Rebecca's voice carried that artificial sweetness that had fooled me for so many months. What are you doing in there? Tommy will be home any minute and he'll want his snack. I looked up from my book, a medical journal I'd retrieved from storage that morning, and smiled pleasantly. Oh, hello, Rebecca. I thought I'd let you handle Tommy's snack today. I've been reading about childhood nutrition, and I want to make sure we're giving him the best possible care. The pause that followed was brief but telling. Rebecca had expected to find me in my usual state of anxious compliance, automatically performing the caregiving tasks she'd assigned me. Instead, she was faced with a woman who seemed perfectly rational and was politely declining to follow the established routine. You've been reading about childhood nutrition? Her voice had an edge now, barely noticeable to someone who hadn't spent months learning to read her moods. Helen, you know that kind of technical material can be confusing. You don't want to overwhelm yourself. There it was, the first attempt to re-establish the narrative of my mental incompetence. But today, instead of doubting myself or getting defensive, I simply smiled and held up the journal. Actually, it's quite fascinating. Did you know that children who experience chronic stress often develop specific nutritional deficiencies? The body's fight-or-flight response depletes certain vitamins and minerals at an accelerated rate. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly. She was trying to assess whether this was a random comment or if I was implying something specific about Tommy's condition. I'm sure that's interesting, but Tommy isn't under any unusual stress. He's a normal, healthy 8-year-old. Of course he is, I agreed mildly, though I did notice he seems more withdrawn lately, and those bruises on his arms yesterday. We already discussed this, Helen. Rebecca's voice was sharp now, her mask slipping just enough for the cameras to catch the change in her expression. Tommy got those bruises playing at school. You're letting your imagination run away with you again. Again, that single word carried months of psychological conditioning. The implication that my concerns were part of a pattern of confused thinking rather than legitimate observations. But instead of backing down, as I had countless times before, I tilted my head thoughtfully. Actually, Rebecca, I've been thinking about that. In my 35 years as a pediatric nurse, I documented thousands of childhood injuries. Those particular bruises on Tommy's arms? They're what we call, quote, grip marks. Very distinctive pattern that occurs when an adult grabs a child with enough force to leave finger-shaped contusions. The silence that followed was electric. Rebecca stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, her carefully constructed facade cracking as she processed what I'd just said. I'd revealed knowledge she didn't know I possessed, used professional terminology she couldn't dismiss as confusion, and made a direct accusation disguised as clinical observation. You're accusing me of hurting Tommy? Her voice was climbing in pitch, but there was calculation behind the apparent shock. She was already planning her counterattack. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, I said calmly. I'm simply sharing my professional observations about injury patterns. Of course, if someone wanted to rule out non-accidental trauma, they could always have Tommy examined by a pediatrician who specializes in child abuse cases. Rebecca's face went pale, then flushed red. I just demonstrated detailed knowledge of child protection protocols, while appearing completely rational and professional. Everything she'd told Michael about my mental decline was being contradicted by my behavior in this moment. Helen, I think you need to lie down. You're obviously having one of your episodes. Episodes. Another key term in Rebecca's gaslighting vocabulary, used to pathologize any behavior that didn't fit her narrative of my incompetence. I feel perfectly fine, thank you. In fact, I feel clearer than I have in months. I marked my place in the medical journal and set it aside, giving Rebecca my full attention. How are you feeling, dear? You look a bit stressed. The role reversal was subtle but complete. Instead of me being the confused patient requiring care, I'd positioned myself as the concerned healthcare professional assessing her well-being. The power dynamic that Rebecca had spent 18 months establishing was shifting in real time. I'm fine, she snapped, then caught herself and forced her voice back to its usual honey-sweet tone. I'm just worried about you, Mom Helen. These paranoid thoughts about Tommy being hurt. It's exactly what the doctor warned us might happen as your condition progresses. What doctor? This was the first I'd heard of any medical professional discussing my supposed condition. But before I could ask for clarification, I heard the front door open and Tommy's voice calling out, I'm home. Rebecca's expression immediately transformed into that of a loving, concerned mother. The speed of the change was remarkable, like watching an actor slip into character. Her shoulders relaxed, her face softened, and when she spoke, her voice carried genuine warmth. Hi, sweetheart. How was school today? Tommy appeared in the living room doorway, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his face lighting up when he saw me sitting calmly in my chair instead of bustling around the kitchen in my usual anxious state. Hi, Grandma Helen. What are you reading? A medical journal, I said, smiling at him. I was just telling your mom about some interesting research on childhood nutrition and stress responses. Tommy's expression flickered, a brief moment of uncertainty as he tried to gauge whether this was a safe topic of conversation. The fact that an 8-year-old child had to perform such complex emotional calculations just to have a normal interaction with his grandmother was heartbreaking. That sounds cool, he said carefully. Can I add a snack? I'm really hungry. Of course, baby, Rebecca said, moving toward the kitchen. I'll make you something special. But I stood up from my chair, smoothly intercepting her. Actually, Tommy, why don't you tell me what you're in the mood for? I was thinking we could make something together. The suggestion was innocuous enough, but it represented a fundamental challenge to the established routine. For months, Rebecca had controlled all interactions between Tommy and me, positioning herself as the primary caregiver while relegating me to the role of supervised assistant. I don't know, Tommy said, looking between his mother and me with obvious anxiety. He'd been trained to defer to Rebecca's preferences, to avoid making choices that might trigger her anger. How about we make your favorite chocolate chip cookies? I suggested. The ones with the extra vanilla that your grandpa Roberto taught me to make? Tommy's face lit up at the mention of Roberto, but he immediately looked to Rebecca for permission. The fact that he felt he needed approval to spend time with his grandmother making cookies spoke volumes about the control dynamics in the house. Tommy has homework to do, Rebecca said firmly. He can have some crackers and juice, but he needs to focus on his schoolwork. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone and checking the time with deliberate casualness, it's only 4:30. He doesn't usually start homework until 5 o'clock, which gives us plenty of time to make cookies and have a nice chat about his day. The specificity of my statement, demonstrating that I was fully aware of Tommy's schedule and capable of managing time appropriately, was another direct challenge to Rebecca's narrative of my mental confusion. I think I know my own son's schedule, Rebecca said, her voice developing that dangerous edge again. Of course you do, I agreed pleasantly. I was just noting that we have time for both activities. Tommy, would you like to wash your hands so we can start baking? Tommy looked between us again, clearly recognizing the undercurrent of conflict but unsure how to navigate it. Finally, his love of baking and his affection for me won out over his fear of his mother's displeasure. Yes, please, Grandma Helen. I really want to make cookies with you. The request was simple, innocent, and completely reasonable. But Rebecca's reaction was immediate and disproportionate. Tommy, I said no cookies. You'll spoil your dinner, and then you'll be too hyper to concentrate on your homework. You know better than to argue with me about this. Quote, her voice had shifted completely. Gone was the loving mother persona, replaced by someone harsh and controlling. Tommy flinched at her tone, his small shoulders hunching, as he prepared for further criticism. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Rebecca was about to demonstrate her true nature while the cameras captured everything. It's okay, sweetheart, I said to Tommy, keeping my voice gentle and reassuring. Why don't you go wash your hands anyway? Maybe we can make cookies another time when your mom isn't feeling so stressed. The comment was calculated to provoke Rebecca while appearing supportive of Tommy. I was publicly acknowledging her unreasonable behavior while offering him comfort, positioning myself as the stable, nurturing adult in the situation. I am not stressed, Rebecca snapped, her control slipping further. I'm trying to maintain some structure and discipline in this house, which apparently no one else is interested in doing. Structure and discipline are important, I agreed. But so is flexibility and kindness. Tommy's had a long day at school, and baking together has always been a special way for us to connect. Connect? Rebecca's voice was rising now, her facade crumbling in real time. Helen, you can barely remember what day it is half the time. How are you going to supervise a child using kitchen equipment? What if he gets hurt because you're not paying attention? There it was, the core of her argument against my competence. But instead of getting defensive, I smiled calmly. Rebecca, I successfully supervised 4 children for 18 years, worked in a pediatric hospital for 35 years, and managed this household independently for over 4 decades. I think I can handle making chocolate chip cookies with my grandson. My response was factual, confident, and delivered without a trace of anger or confusion. Anyone watching the footage would see a competent woman defending her abilities against unreasonable criticism. Tommy had been watching this exchange with growing distress, his 8-year-old mind struggling to understand why the adults in his life were arguing about something as simple as making cookies. His reaction was about to provide the most damning evidence yet of Rebecca's impact on his emotional well-being. Please don't fight, he whispered, tears starting to form in his eyes. I don't need cookies. I don't need anything. Please don't be mad. Quote. The heartbreak in his voice was devastating. This child had been so conditioned to blame himself for adult conflict that he was willing to sacrifice his own simple desires to keep peace in the house. Rebecca's response was swift and revealing. See what you've done? She hissed at me. You've upset him with your stubborn insistence on doing things you're not capable of handling. This is exactly why we need to have that conversation with Michael about your living situation. My living situation. She was already threatening to have me removed from my own home because I dared to suggest making cookies with my grandson. But I kept my voice level and caring as I knelt down to Tommy's eye level. Sweetheart, you haven't done anything wrong. Sometimes adults disagree about things, but that's not your fault, and you don't need to fix it. Would you like to go to your room and start your homework? I'll bring you a snack in a little while. Tommy nodded eagerly, clearly desperate to escape the tension in the room. As he headed toward the stairs, I heard him whisper, Sorry, Mommy, as he passed Rebecca, another heartbreaking indication of how thoroughly she'd trained him to take responsibility for her emotional state. Once Tommy was upstairs, Rebecca turned to face me with undisguised hostility. What the hell do you think you're doing, Helen? The profanity and venom in her voice would have been shocking 18 months ago. Now it simply confirmed everything I'd suspected about her true nature. I think I'm trying to have a normal relationship with my grandson, I said quietly. The same relationship I've had with him since he was born. Your relationship with Tommy is not normal, Rebecca snarled. You're possessive, interfering, and completely inappropriate. You undermine my authority as his mother. You confuse him with mixed messages. And now you're having paranoid delusions about abuse that could destroy this family. Each accusation was a masterpiece of projection, describing her own behavior while attributing it to me. The possessiveness, the interference, the inappropriate control, the mixed messages that confused Tommy, all of it was coming from her. Rebecca, I said calmly, I love Tommy, and I want what's best for him. If you're concerned about my interactions with him, perhaps we should discuss this with Michael when he gets home. Michael already knows about your problems, she said with satisfaction. He's seen the documentation of your episodes, your memory issues, your increasing paranoia. He agrees that we need to look into alternative living arrangements for you. Alternative living arrangements. She was preparing to have me institutionalized or moved to assisted living, removing the last obstacle to her complete control over Tommy. What kind of alternative arrangements? I asked, keeping my voice curious rather than confrontational. Rebecca smiled, sensing victory. There are some very nice facilities in the area that specialize in caring for elderly people with cognitive issues. Places where you'd have professional supervision and wouldn't have to worry about the stress of managing a household or caring for a young child. She was describing my future imprisonment with the same tone she might use to recommend a vacation resort. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. And what would happen to Tommy if I weren't here? Tommy would be fine, she said dismissively. Better than fine, actually. He wouldn't have to deal with the confusion of having two authority figures giving him conflicting messages. He could focus on school, on being a normal kid, without worrying about his grandmother's declining mental state. The picture she was painting was clear. With me removed from the equation, she would have complete control over Tommy with no witnesses to her abuse, no alternative authority figure for him to turn to, and no one to question her version of events. I see, I said thoughtfully. And when are you planning to discuss these arrangements with me? Michael wanted to wait until after the holidays, but honestly, Helen, your behavior today has been so erratic that I think we need to move up the timeline. The paranoid accusations about Tommy, the refusal to follow reasonable household routines, the insistence on doing things you're clearly not capable of handling safely, it's all escalating. Every normal thing I'd done today, reading a medical journal, suggesting we make cookies, defending my competence, was being reframed as evidence of cognitive decline and dangerous behavior. You seem to have given this a lot of thought, I observed. I've been researching options for months, Rebecca admitted, not realizing she was confessing to a long-term plan to have me removed. I've toured several facilities, spoken with admissions counselors, even consulted with a lawyer about the process for when family members are no longer capable of making decisions for themselves. A lawyer. She'd been planning legal action to have me declared incompetent, probably building a case with the fabricated notebook entries and testimony about my supposed episodes. That's very thorough of you, I said, though I have to say I feel perfectly capable of making my own decisions. Rebecca laughed, a sound without humor. Helen, 20 minutes ago you were making paranoid accusations about child abuse based on normal playground injuries. You wanted to put an 8-year-old child in a dangerous kitchen situation because you can't remember that he's not supposed to have sugar before dinner. You're sitting here reading medical journals that you can't possibly understand, trying to diagnose family members with conditions you know nothing about. She was taking every reasonable thing I'd done and spinning it as evidence of incompetence. The medical journal became something I couldn't understand. My concern about Tommy's bruises became paranoid accusations. My suggestion to make cookies became dangerous negligence. It was a masterful performance, and if the cameras hadn't been rolling, if I hadn't spent months documenting her behavior, if I hadn't called Dr. Chen to verify my own competence, I might have started to believe her myself. You may be right, I said, appearing to consider her points. Perhaps I should see a doctor for an evaluation. Rebecca's eyes lit up with triumph. I think that would be an excellent idea. In fact, I've already identified a geriatric specialist who has experience with these kinds of cognitive assessments. Of course she had. Probably someone who would be receptive to her version of my supposed symptoms. Someone who would provide the professional opinion she needed to support a competency hearing. That's very thoughtful of you to arrange, I said, though I think I'd prefer to choose my own doctor, to avoid any appearance of conflict of interest. The suggestion that there might be a conflict of interest clearly hadn't occurred to Rebecca, and she didn't like the implication. What kind of conflict of interest could there possibly be? She demanded. Well, you have a clear preference for the outcome of any evaluation, I said mildly. You want me to be declared incompetent so you can have me removed from the house. A doctor you've chosen might be influenced by that desired outcome, even unconsciously. Rebecca's face flushed red. I'd just demonstrated logical reasoning, awareness of potential bias, and appropriate skepticism about her motives, none of which fit her narrative of my cognitive decline. That's ridiculous, she sputtered. I don't want you declared incompetent. I want you to get the help you need. And what kind of help do you think I need? Professional care, she said firmly. Medical supervision. A structured environment where you can't hurt yourself or others through poor judgment or forgetfulness. Others. She was implying that I was a danger to Tommy, laying the groundwork for an emergency removal if necessary. We were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Tommy appeared in the doorway, having changed out of his school clothes into play clothes, his homework folder in his hand. Mom, I can't find my math worksheet, he said quietly. It was in my folder this morning, but now it's gone. Rebecca's demeanor shifted instantly back to concerned mother mode. Let me look, sweetie. Maybe it fell out in your backpack. But as she moved toward Tommy, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a brief moment, maybe 2 seconds, where her expression before the mask went back on was one of irritation and calculation. She was annoyed by the interruption, and she was already planning how to use this minor problem as further evidence of household chaos caused by my supposed incompetence. Actually, I said, standing up from my chair, I saw some papers fall out of Tommy's backpack when he came in. They might be on the floor by the front door. Tommy's face brightened with relief, but Rebecca shot me a look of pure venom. I just solved the problem she was planning to use against me. I'll go check, Tommy said, hurrying toward the front door. Tommy, wait, Rebecca called after him. Let me help you look. You know how easily you lose track of things. She was following him, probably planning to hide the worksheet if it was there, or to use its absence as evidence of Tommy's stress and my inability to provide proper supervision. But I followed too, my presence making it impossible for her to manipulate the situation without being obvious about it. Tommy found his worksheet immediately, just inside the front door where it had fallen from his overstuffed backpack. His relief was palpable. In Rebecca's house, losing homework was probably treated as a serious offense requiring punishment. There it is, he said happily. Thanks for remembering, Grandma Helen. You're welcome, sweetheart, I said. It happens to everyone sometimes. Rebecca's jaw was tight with frustration. What should have been a minor incident she could exploit had turned into evidence of my helpfulness and Tommy's trust in me. Well, she said with forced brightness, crisis averted. Tommy, why don't you get started on your homework at the kitchen table? I'll be in to help you in a few minutes. As Tommy headed toward the kitchen, Rebecca turned to me with barely contained fury. This conversation isn't over, Helen, she said in a low voice. We're going to finish discussing your future living arrangements when Michael gets home. I look forward to it, I said pleasantly. I'm sure Michael will be very interested in everything we've talked about today. What Rebecca didn't know was that Michael was going to be very interested indeed, because every word of our conversation, every mask slip, every threat and manipulation had been captured in high definition by the cameras hidden throughout the house. For 18 months, Rebecca had been building a case against my mental competence, based on fabricated evidence and twisted interpretations of normal behavior. Today, I'd begun building a case against her based on her own words and actions, documented by technology she didn't even know existed. The real battle was just beginning. Michael's key turned in the front door at exactly 6:47 p.m., 13 minutes later than his usual arrival time. I knew this because I'd been tracking his patterns for weeks, preparing for this moment when everything would either fall into place or fall apart completely. I'm home, he called out, his voice carrying the familiar exhaustion of a man trying to rebuild his career while managing family stress he didn't fully understand. From my position in the living room, I could see him hanging his jacket in the hallway closet, loosening his tie, performing the small rituals of transition from work mode to home mode. For 18 months, coming home had meant walking into a house where his mother seemed increasingly confused and fragile, where his wife appeared to be heroically managing an impossible situation, and where his son was simply part of the background of adult concerns. Tonight, he was walking into a completely different reality. Hi, Daddy. Tommy's voice came from the kitchen, where he'd been working on homework under my supervision for the past 2 hours. The difference in his tone was subtle but significant. There was genuine happiness there instead of the careful neutrality he usually displayed around family interactions. Hey, buddy, Michael replied, his voice warming as it always did when he talked to Tommy. Whatever other problems existed in our family, Michael's love for his son had never been in question. How was school today? Really good. Grandma Helen helped me with my math, and we talked about making cookies tomorrow if that's okay with you. The innocent statement was perfectly crafted. Tommy was seeking permission from his father rather than his mother, implying that Helen was competent enough to help with homework and forward-thinking enough to plan activities for the following day. To anyone listening, it sounded like a normal interaction between a grandfather and grandson. But I could hear Rebecca's sharp intake of breath from the kitchen, and I knew she was recognizing the strategic implications of Tommy's words. That sounds great, Tommy, Michael said, moving toward the kitchen. Where's your mom? She's upstairs, Tommy replied. She said she had a headache and needed to lie down for a while. This was partially true. Rebecca had disappeared upstairs about an hour ago, claiming illness, but I suspected she was actually strategizing for the confrontation she knew was coming. She'd spent the afternoon since our conversation making phone calls. I'd heard her voice through the ceiling, though not the specific words. "And where's Grandma Helen?" "Right here," I said, appearing in the kitchen doorway with perfect timing. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Michael looked at me with the careful assessment that had become habitual over the past months, checking for signs of confusion, disorientation, or inappropriate behavior. What he saw instead was a woman who looked alert, well-groomed, and completely in control of her faculties. "Fine, Mom. Long, but fine." He paused, taking in the domestic scene. Tommy working contentedly at the kitchen table, me standing nearby with a dish towel in my hands. The general atmosphere of calm productivity. "Everything okay here today?" It was a loaded question. Everything okay had become code for. Has Mom had any episodes? Has she done anything concerning? Are there any incidents I need to know about? "Actually," I said, setting down the dish towel and giving him my full attention, "we need to talk. There are some things that happened today that I think you need to be aware of." Michael's expression immediately shifted to concern. This was the conversation he'd been dreading for months, the moment when he'd have to make difficult decisions about his mother's care and living situation. "Tommy," I said gently, "why don't you take your homework upstairs and work in your room for a while? Your dad and I need to have a grown-up conversation." Tommy looked between us with the hypervigilance I'd learned to recognize in children from chaotic households. "Are you going to fight?" he asked quietly. "No, sweetheart," I assured him. "We're just going to talk about some important family things. Nothing for you to worry about." As Tommy gathered his homework and headed upstairs, I noticed Michael watching the interaction carefully. His son seemed comfortable with me, was seeking reassurance from me, was responding to my authority without question. None of this fit Rebecca's narrative of a confused grandmother who was becoming a burden and potentially a danger. "Mom, what's going on?" Michael asked once we were alone. Instead of answering immediately, I walked to my laptop, which I'd positioned on the kitchen counter, and opened the surveillance application. "Michael, I want you to watch something. And before you say anything, I want you to know that everything you're about to see was recorded legally in common areas of my own home." His eyebrows rose in surprise. "You've been recording conversations?" "I installed a security system yesterday," I said calmly, "after some concerning incidents that I wanted to document properly." I clicked on the first video file, recorded at 4:17 p.m. when Rebecca had come downstairs. "This is from earlier today. I'd like you to watch it and tell me what you see." For the next 20 minutes, Michael watched his wife transform from the loving, concerned caregiver he thought he knew into someone manipulative, controlling, and openly hostile. He saw her accuse me of paranoid delusions, threaten to have me institutionalized, admit to months of planning my removal from the house, and reveal her consultation with lawyers about having me declared incompetent. Most damaging of all, he watched her casual cruelty toward Tommy, the way she spoke to him when she thought no one important was listening, the unreasonable restrictions she placed on normal childhood activities, the systematic way she trained him to take responsibility for adult emotions. "Jesus Christ," Michael whispered as the video ended. "Mom, how has she been treating you?" "This is actually a relatively mild example," I said quietly, "but I wanted you to see it because this is the first time I've captured her real personality on video." I opened my yellow legal pad, now filled with dozens of pages of documented incidents. "Michael, I need to show you something else. This is 18 months of systematic psychological abuse, financial manipulation, and isolation tactics that your wife has been using against me." For the next hour, I walked my son through the comprehensive documentation I'd compiled. The pattern of gaslighting, the fake notebook entries, the deliberate creation of situations that would make me appear confused or incompetent, the gradual isolation from friends and activities, the forced move to the back bedroom, the threats of institutionalization. Michael's face grew pale as the full scope of Rebecca's manipulation became clear. "Mom, why didn't you tell me any of this before?" "Because she was very careful to make me doubt my own perceptions," I said. And because every time I tried to voice concerns, she had documentation to support her version of events. The notebook full of my supposed episodes, her medical background lending authority to her observations, your own growing concerns about my memory and judgment. My concerns, Michael said slowly. She's been feeding me information about your condition. Telling me about incidents, suggesting I watch for certain behaviors, recommending that we consider alternative living arrangements. Exactly. She's been manipulating both of us, but in different ways. You were being trained to see me as a burden who needed to be managed. I was being trained to see myself as incompetent and dependent on her care. Michael sat down heavily at the kitchen table, running his hands through his hair. Oh God, Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have seen this. I should have questioned. Michael, she's very good at this. This isn't the first time she's done something like this. I opened my laptop again and showed him the research I'd conducted that afternoon. I spent some time looking into Rebecca's background today. Her first marriage ended when her husband filed for divorce, citing emotional abuse and citing concerns about her treatment of Tommy. Her second marriage ended when that husband died unexpectedly, leaving her a substantial life insurance payout. Michael's face went white. You think I think your wife is a predator who targets vulnerable people and systematically destroys their support systems so she can control and exploit them. You were vulnerable after your divorce and job loss. I was vulnerable after your father's death. Tommy has been vulnerable his entire life. As if summoned by our conversation, Rebecca appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was dressed carefully, a soft sweater, minimal makeup, her hair styled to look slightly disheveled as if she'd been resting due to illness. The performance was subtle but calculated to appear sympathetic and non-threatening. Michael, you're home, she said with a tired smile. I heard voices and wanted to come down to say hello. Michael looked at his wife with new eyes, seeing the careful staging of her appearance, hearing the practiced tone in her voice. Rebecca, we need to talk. Of course, honey, but first I should tell you that your mother had several concerning episodes today. I'm worried that her condition is deteriorating more rapidly than we thought. Quote. She moved to the kitchen counter where she kept her notebook, the one Tommy had told me about, the one filled with fabricated evidence of my mental decline. But when she opened it, her confidence faltered slightly. I'd spent the afternoon photographing every page, documenting her months of careful lies. According to my notes, she began, but Michael cut her off. Rebecca, I've seen the videos. The change in her expression was instantaneous. The mask of concerned caregiving disappeared, replaced by cold calculation, as she assessed this new threat to her control. What videos? The security footage from today, Michael said, his voice gaining strength. I've seen how you really treat my mother when you think no one is watching. I've heard you threaten to have her institutionalized, admit to planning her removal from her own home, consult with lawyers about having her declared incompetent. Rebecca's eyes flicked to me, then back to Michael. I could see her mind racing, trying to find a way to spin this new development to her advantage. Michael, your mother has been having paranoid episodes where she imagines conversations that never happened. Installing hidden cameras, making recordings. This is exactly the kind of behavior that indicates her mental state is declining rapidly. It was a masterful attempt at deflection, turning my evidence gathering into proof of the mental illness she'd been fabricating. But Michael had seen too much, heard too much to be manipulated anymore. I watched you, Rebecca. I heard your voice, saw your face, witnessed your behavior. This wasn't my mother's imagination or confusion. This was you, showing your true nature when you thought there would be no consequences. Rebecca's composure cracked further. You don't understand the stress I've been under, trying to care for someone with dementia, while managing a household and raising a child. Sometimes I lose my patience, but that doesn't mean... Mom doesn't have dementia, Michael said firmly. I just spent an hour reviewing 18 months of your systematic psychological abuse. The fake notebook entries, the manufactured episodes, the deliberate isolation tactics. You've been gaslighting both of us. The clinical terminology seemed to surprise Rebecca. She hadn't expected Michael to understand the technical aspects of psychological manipulation. That's ridiculous, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Michael, you've seen the evidence of your mother's decline. You've witnessed the memory problems, the confusion, the inappropriate behavior. I've witnessed what you wanted me to see, Michael replied. What you carefully constructed to support your narrative. I decided it was time to play my final card. Rebecca, I said quietly, would you like to explain to Michael why you've been researching geriatric specialists, consulting with lawyers about competency hearings, and touring assisted living facilities? The color drained from her face completely. She hadn't realized that her planning for my removal had been so transparent, or that I'd been aware of her activities. I was trying to be prepared, she said weakly, in case Helen's condition deteriorated to the point where she needed professional care. You were trying to steal my house, I said calmly, remove me from Tommy's life, eliminate any witnesses to your abuse, and gain control of my assets. Michael stood up from the kitchen table, his face set with grim determination. Rebecca, I want you to pack your things and leave, tonight. What? Her voice climbed to a higher pitch, her careful composure finally shattering completely. Michael, you can't be serious. I'm your wife. This is my home, too. This was never your home, Michael said firmly. This is my mother's house, which she generously opened to us when we needed help. And you've repaid that kindness by systematically abusing her and our son. Our son? Rebecca's voice turned shrill. Tommy is my son. You have no legal right to keep him from me. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone, I spent some time today consulting with family law attorneys. Given the documented evidence of child abuse, psychological manipulation, and elder abuse, any family court in Oregon would grant emergency custody to Michael pending a full investigation. Rebecca spun to face me, her mask completely gone now, revealing the cold predator underneath. You manipulative old bitch. You think you've won something here? The profanity and venom in her voice would have shocked me 18 months ago. Now it simply provided more evidence for the legal proceedings that were about to begin. I think I've protected my grandson and reclaimed my home, I said calmly. Everything else is just paperwork. Michael moved to stand beside me, a gesture of solidarity that hadn't happened in months. Rebecca, you have 1 hour to pack your essential belongings. Everything else can be arranged later through lawyers. You'll regret this, Rebecca said, her voice low and threatening. Both of you. I know things about this family, about your precious mother's condition, about Tommy's real parentage. I can destroy all of you. The threats were empty bluster, but they revealed the depth of her desperation and rage. This was a woman who had built her life around control and manipulation, and she was watching her carefully constructed world collapse in real time. The only thing you're going to destroy is your own credibility, I said. Every threat you make, every lie you tell, every attempt at manipulation just provides more evidence for the restraining order we'll be filing tomorrow. Rebecca looked between Michael and me, perhaps finally realizing that she had underestimated both of us. The confused old woman and the manipulated son she thought she could control indefinitely had become adversaries capable of matching her strategic thinking and exceeding her resources. Fine, she said finally, but this isn't over. I'll fight for custody of Tommy, and I'll make sure everyone knows about Helen's mental problems and Michael's inability to provide a stable home. You're welcome to try, Michael said, but you'll be fighting from a position of documented abuse and manipulation, with no credibility and no support system. Good luck with that. As Rebecca stormed upstairs to pack, I heard Tommy's bedroom door open and his footsteps on the stairs. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his young face anxious and confused. What's happening? He asked quietly. I heard yelling. Michael knelt down to his son's eye level, his voice gentle but serious. Tommy, your mom is going to be staying somewhere else for a while. Grandma Helen and I need to talk to you about some things that have been happening in our family. Over the next hour, while Rebecca crashed around upstairs packing her belongings, Michael and I carefully explained to Tommy that the treatment he'd been receiving wasn't normal or acceptable. We told him that adults should never hurt children, that his thoughts and feelings mattered, and that he would never again have to be afraid of expressing affection for his grandmother or anyone else he loved. Tommy's relief was palpable. The tension that had been visible in his small shoulders for months began to ease as he realized that the eggshells he'd been walking on were being swept away, Does this mean I can make cookies with Grandma Helen whenever I want? He asked. Within reason, Michael said with a smile. The first genuine smile I'd seen from my son in months. And it means you never have to be afraid of hugging your grandmother, or telling her about your day, or asking for help when you need it. Tommy launched himself into my arms then, holding on with the fierce desperation of a child who had been denied normal affection for too long. I love you, Grandma Helen, he whispered against my shoulder. I love you too, sweetheart, I whispered back. And I promise you'll never have to be afraid in this house again. When Rebecca finally came downstairs with her suitcases, she found the three of us sitting together at the kitchen table, looking like the family we'd always been meant to be. Her attempt to divide and control us had not only failed, but it ultimately brought us closer together. This is what you want? She asked Michael, her voice filled with venom. To destroy our marriage over the paranoid fantasies of a senile old woman? I want to protect my son and my mother from someone who has been systematically abusing them, Michael replied calmly. If that destroys our marriage, then it wasn't worth preserving. Rebecca's final exit was anticlimactic. She simply grabbed her bags, walked to the front door, and left without another word. The house felt lighter immediately, as if a dark cloud had lifted from rooms that had been under shadow for too long. That evening, as I tucked Tommy into bed in his own room for the first time in months without him being afraid of what tomorrow might bring, he asked me a question that broke my heart and filled it simultaneously. Grandma Helen, was I bad? Is that why Mom was always mad at me? Oh, sweetheart, I said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. You were never bad. Not even a little bit. Sometimes adults have problems that have nothing to do with the children in their lives, but they make those children think it's their fault. None of what happened was because of you. Promise? I promise. You are a wonderful, smart, kind, brave little boy, and anyone who can't see that has something wrong with them, not with you. Quote. As I turned off his light and headed downstairs, I found Michael sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. Mom, he said without looking up, I'm so sorry. I should have seen what was happening. I should have protected you and Tommy. I sat down beside him and put my hand on his shoulder. Michael, she was very good at manipulation. She had us both questioning our own perceptions and accepting her version of reality. The important thing is that when you saw the evidence, you acted on it immediately. How do you forgive me for letting this go on for so long? Because you're my son, and because you chose to protect your family when it mattered most. That's all I've ever wanted from you. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. The surveillance footage, combined with my detailed documentation and Tommy's testimony given in a child-friendly court setting, provided overwhelming evidence of Rebecca's abuse and manipulation. She was granted supervised visitation with Tommy twice a month, contingent on her completing anger management and parenting classes. She was prohibited from having any contact with me and banned from entering my property. The restraining order was granted without opposition from her attorney, who seemed to recognize that fighting the evidence would only make things worse for his client. Most importantly, Michael was granted full custody of Tommy, with my house designated as the child's primary residence. The family court judge noted that the child's obvious comfort and security in my care made it clear that removing him from my influence would be detrimental to his well-being. 6 months later, our house feels like home again. Tommy laughs freely, hugs enthusiastically, and has stopped apologizing for normal childhood behavior. Michael has regained the confidence and warmth that Rebecca's manipulation had slowly eroded. And I have reclaimed not just my independence, but my role as the family matriarch who protects and nurtures, rather than being seen as a burden to be managed. The woman who threw scalding soup at a 70-year-old grandmother thought she was dealing with a helpless victim. Instead, she discovered that age brings not just vulnerability, but wisdom, strategic thinking, and the fierce determination that comes from a lifetime of protecting the people you love. Tommy is now 9 years old, thriving in school, and has never once asked when his mother is coming home. Michael has found peace in rebuilding our family on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. And I have learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give your loved ones is refusing to be a victim. Rebecca was sentenced to 2 years of probation for elder abuse and child endangerment. She moved to another state, where I hope she's getting the help she needs to address whatever drove her to prey on vulnerable family members. As for me, I'm 71 now, sharper and more confident than I've been in years. I volunteer at the local children's hospital, using my experience to help other families recognize signs of abuse and manipulation. I've become an advocate for elder rights, speaking at community centers about how to protect yourself from family members who would exploit your vulnerabilities. And every evening, I sit in my living room, not the back guest room where Rebecca exiled me, but the main living room where I belong, watching Tommy do his homework while Michael reads the newspaper, and I'm reminded that family isn't about control or manipulation or who has power over whom. Family is about love, protection, and the willingness to fight for each other when it matters most. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or violence, but with documentation, strategic thinking, and the quiet determination of someone who refuses to be a victim. I threw hot soup on me and said, "Stop being dramatic." So the next day I took action. And we all lived happily ever after. Follow my story until the end, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. What would you have done in my situation? Have you ever had to protect a child from an abusive family member? Share your experiences in the comments below, and remember, it's never too late to stand up for yourself and the people you love. Subscribe for more stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to protect their families. You are stronger than you know.